0347 hours, October 15th, 1944. Peleliu Island. Corporal James Mitchell, 23, is pressed so hard against the coral outcropping that the rock is cutting into his cheek. Another Japanese bullet snaps past and throws a shower of white sparks off the limestone 6 inches from his face. Tiny fragments sting his skin. He doesn't flinch. There's nowhere else to go. The cave mouth is 30 yards out, a black jagged hole in a wall of twisted coral and jungle roots. It's been spitting death all night. Rifle cracks, grenades, sudden screams. But now, one man has come out of it and simply refused to stop. Mitchell's M1 carbine feels like a toy in his hands. He's already put 3 rounds into the man's chest, center mass, just like the manuals and the instructors in California said. The man keeps coming. He's bareheaded, hair plastered to his skull with sweat and dust. His face is a rigid mask of rage. A long, curved sword is raised over his head, the blade catching a strip of moonlight every time he takes a step. 25 yards. Mitchell grits his teeth and fires again. The little .30 carbine round smacks into the man's shoulder. He sees the impact, cloth puffing, a brief stumble. The Japanese soldier staggers, then drives forward again. 20 yards now. Mitchell can hear him breathing over the ringing in his own ears. Harsh animal breaths. The kind men make when they've decided they're either going to kill or die in the next 5 seconds. Everybody who's been in the Pacific for more than a week knows the truth Mitchell is living right now. The standard 110 grain, .30 carbine ball round doesn't always stop a determined man. It doesn't matter if you hit them. It matters where. It matters how many times. And it matters how close they get before one of those little bullets finally finds something vital. 15 yards. Mitchell's squad is strung out behind him in a shell. How Scrape hacked into the coral. They've been trading grenades and blind fire with this cave for an hour. 2 men are already down. Nobody can get a clean shot around his position without standing up into the cave's line of fire. If this one gets through him, he'll be in the trench with the rest of them. Mitchell's finger finds the trigger again. But this time, something is different. The magazine in his carbine isn't the usual dull gray 15-rounder. It's a heavier 30-round stick, scrounged from a Marine who knew a guy in supply. And the rounds inside it didn't come from the standard cardboard boxes marked carbine ball. He'd slapped this magazine in just before the last push because of a rumor. A crate off a wrecked aircraft pallet, red stenciling no one could quite read in the dim light of the ammo dump. A tired ordnance corporal whispering, "Those are special. Aircraft use. Don't ask me how they got here." "Special issue," someone had said. "Experimental," someone else had muttered. Now there's no time to wonder what that really means. Mitchell takes a breath. The cave wall is a blur at the edge of his vision. The charging man fills his sight picture now, chest, throat, the gleam of white teeth. He squeezes. The carbine's report is different. Not louder exactly, sharper. The muzzle flash is wrong, brighter, edged with a strange greenish-white core instead of the usual dull orange. The bullet that leaves the barrel isn't a stubby little ball round. From Mitchell's angle, and in the chaos, all he really sees is the effect. The Japanese soldier's chest erupts. For a split second, it looks like someone shoved a fist-sized firecracker into his uniform and lit it. There's a hard white flash at the point of impact, like a camera bulb going off. Tiny sparks spray out in a cone. Bits of cloth and something darker spray backward. The man's sword arm spasms. The blade flies from his hand and spins off into the dark. He doesn't stumble this time. He folds. It's as if his whole chest caves in around that point of light. One instant he's coming forward with the inevitability of a train. The next his legs are gone underneath him, and he slams flat onto the coral with a wet, final sound. Mitchell stares for half a heartbeat, stunned. Down the line someone yells, What are you feeding that thing?" He doesn't have an answer. The only thing he knows is that the round he just fired hit like nothing his toy carbine has ever thrown before. And the cave isn't empty. Behind the fallen man, shapes are moving in the darkness, shadows against shadow. Another helmet, another rifle barrel, another shouted phrase in Japanese, ragged and confused. Mitchell slams his back tighter against the coral, works the trigger again. The muzzle flashes with that same green-white glare. Rounds scream into the cave mouth, each one leaving a brief, ghostly streak in the air, like miniature pieces of anti-aircraft fire driven almost flat. Inside, deeper voices bark something in Japanese, short, shocked, full of a new word. He can't understand it. Much later, a prisoner will say it slowly for an interpreter, trying to describe what those strange glowing bullets looked like to men who had only ever seen such fire reaching up into the night sky. Sora no Hai, sky fire. For now, all Mitchell knows is this. For the first time since he was handed an M1 carbine, he isn't thinking about how little it hits. He's thinking about how many of those special rounds he has left, and how many men in that cave are about to meet them. He shouts over his shoulder, voice hoarse, "Cover me! I've got something they're not ready for." Cut to black. Long before he was firing strange green-tipped rounds into a cave on Peleliu, James Mitchell was learning a different kind of ballistics. He grew up outside Topeka, Kansas, on a patch of land that his father still insisted on calling a farm, even after most of the plowed acres had turned into pasture. They didn't make much money on crops. What kept the place afloat was the small airstrip his father had carved out of one of the flattest fields. It was nothing fancy, just a grass strip, a couple of rickety hangars, and a windsock that spent as much time hanging limp as it did pointing anywhere. But crop dusters used it. So did a handful of rich men from the city who liked to buzz the countryside in their little civil aircraft on weekends. To a boy like James, those planes might as well have been dragons. He watched them growl down the strip and haul themselves into the sky, watched their exhaust spit flickers of flame in the evening. He'd lie on his back in the grass and trace their paths with his finger, imagining what it would be like to control that kind of motion. His father taught him to respect machines. "Engines don't care about your feelings," the old man would say, passing him a greasy wrench as they worked under a cowling. "You feed them right, keep the pressures where they belong, they serve you. You push them wrong, they blow up. Simple as that." By the time Mitchell was 18, he could tear down and reassemble a Continental aircraft engine in a weekend. He knew about octane ratings, about detonation, about what happened when combustion outran design. He had a more casual understanding of firearms. There was a .22 on the wall, an old shotgun, the usual tools of rural life. He could shoot straight enough to knock cans off fence posts, but guns didn't fascinate him the way pistons and propellers did. The war changed that. Pearl Harbor reached Kansas as a V.G. Ustum voice on the radio and a gasp in the hardware store. Within weeks, the little airstrip saw more khaki and olive drab than Sunday coats. The Army Air Forces set up a small auxiliary field nearby. Planes came and went with a new urgency. Mitchell wanted in. The Air Corps didn't need more pilots by the time he got to the recruiter, but it needed men who understood airfields, engines, and the endless logistics of keeping planes flying. They trained him as an aviation engineer and security corporal, a man who could run a wire line, swing a hammer, and stand a watch with a rifle. In basic, they handed him an M1 Garand first. He loved it. Heavy, solid, with a satisfying thunk and a punch that twisted his shoulder if he got lazy. Then, on the line for airfield duty, they swapped it for something else. The M1 carbine felt like a joke by comparison. It was half the weight. The bolt felt toy-like after the Garand's hearty clack. The .30 carbine cartridge, when he held it in his hand next to a .30-06, looked like someone had cut the real round in half. "Perfect for you airfield boys," the supply sergeant had said cheerfully. "You're not storming bunkers, you're chasing saboteurs." On paper, the carbine made sense. Lighter load for men who had to carry radios, tools, or fuel hoses, less recoil for quick close-range work, more rounds on tap. The manuals talked about it as a modern answer to the old pistol and rifle problem. Then Mitchell went to the Pacific. Airfield duty on the maps looked like rear-line work. On the volcanic ridges and coral teeth of islands like Peleliu, there was no rear line. The runway was a strip of pulverized coral hacked out under fire. The flight line was one ridge away from caves packed with Japanese soldiers who had orders to contest every inch of the island. They hit the engineers and airfield guards like they hit everybody else. At night, from caves, often at distances where the difference between a .30-06 and a .30 carbine round meant life and death. The first time Mitchell saw a man take multiple carbine hits and keep coming, it rewrote everything he thought he knew about bullet and body. It was on the approach to a ridgeline overlooking the eventual airstrip. A Japanese soldier, gaunt and filthy, broke from a spider hole with a bayonet fixed. He was no more than 30 yards out. The first carbine round hit him square. He jerked. The second took him in the gut. The third somewhere in the ribs. He should have dropped. Instead, he let out a sound that wasn't quite human and kept coming, covering another 10 yards before a bar scythed him down. Later, in the shaky silence, Mitchell heard an older Marine mutter, "Paper gun," as he prodded the dead man with a boot. "Should have brought 'em all Garans," another said. "This little pill doesn't scare 'em." Mitchell felt the weight of his carbine then in a new way. He knew ballistics numbers. He could read tables. But standing there on coral spattered with someone else's blood, he understood the gap between yard lines and real flesh. By the time his unit was assigned to help secure and build up the airstrip on Peleliu, he'd heard every version of the complaint. The carbine's a kid's gun. It's fine if you're shooting deserters in the rear, not caves. The Japs take 3 and keep coming. He also knew there wasn't a magic crate of Garans coming down the line just for him. What he had was what he was going to fight with. So he started paying more attention to the other kind of ammunition on the island. In the dumps behind the beachhead, piles of crates marked for aircraft use sat in ragged rows, 50 for wing guns, 30-06 for flexible mounts, still in service on patrol planes and some Army aircraft. He'd see ground crewmen splice belts of mixed ball, armor-piercing, and tracer together, feeding them into guns that spat streams of light into the night sky to ward off low-flying attackers. He watched those luminous threads climb into the dark and thought of something his father had told him long before the war. The right fuel, the right mixture, turns a machine into something else. He began to wonder if the same could be done with bullets. Not in a fantasy way, in a technical way. He knew enough to understand you couldn't just jam a .30-06 aircraft round into a carbine and expect anything but disaster. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to borrow a little of that sky-filling fire and put it into the small, underpowered case the carbine depended on. Peleliu, with its heat, its caves, its endless close-quarters fights, was not a place that rewarded half measures. If there was anywhere to try a stupid idea like that, it was here. Peleliu was a furnace. By mid-October, the official battle was already being called over by high command. The airfield was in American hands. The Marines had planted flags on the key ridges. Newspapers back home would soon run tidy maps with arrows pointing to victory. On the ground, under the sharp sun and in the deep shadows, the island was still a killing ground. The Japanese garrison hadn't pulled back and waited to die. They dug in, deep. Caves honeycombed the coral hills. Some were natural, some blasted out by sweat and dynamite. Tunnels linked them. One entrance would spit fire, while the real exit waited around a flank. Mitchell's engineering unit found themselves pulled off bulldozer duty and handed grenades and flamethrowers more often than shovels. Clear this cave, fill that one, guard this trail, protect the approach to the airstrip. On the Umur-Brogol ridges, the Point and Bloody Nose Ridge sat like broken teeth over everything, pouring fire into any American bold enough to move in daylight. At night, smaller teeth bit. Squads of Japanese would slip from cave mouths, probe the lines, and sometimes launch full-throated banzai charges from one rock line to another, hoping to throw the Americans off just long enough to snipe at bulldozers or mortar crews. In one of those smaller fights, the Carbine's shortcomings got rammed home. Mitchell's squad had set up in a shallow trench hacked into the coral near a cave cluster that overlooked the half-finished runway. Their job was simple on paper: hold this line while demolition teams wired other cave entrances for blasting. As dusk turned to night, shapes boiled out of a crack in the rock not 50 yards away. There were maybe a dozen at first, then more. Rifles, bayonets. One man with a sword, screaming. Mitchell and the others opened up. M1 Garands on the line did their grim work. 30.06 rounds slamming men do, and hard when they hit center mass. The bar punctuated it with heavy, fast bursts. The Carbines were another story. Mitchell watched his own bullets hit. He wasn't guessing. Sparks off helmets, puffs of cloth, bodies jolting. But more than once, a man who should have dropped simply didn't. He saw one soldier take 2 carbine hits in the upper chest and keep coming, face a mess of blood and dirt, bayonet shaking as he drove forward. It took a final, brutal close-range blast from a shotgun in the trench to stop him. Afterward, sitting in the cordite stinking groove they called a foxhole, Mitchell stared at his carbine across his lap. "It works," Private Langley, the bar gunner, said, trying to be kind. "You just gotta put more into 'em." "That's the problem," Mitchell said quietly. "More into them means more time. More time means less time sending rounds at the next one." He glanced up at the ridgeline. Somewhere up there, Japanese observers were watching with binoculars, learning with each contact exactly how the Americans fought, which guns hurt, which didn't. "They're not stupid," he muttered. "They see a Garand, they stay low. They see a carbine, they roll the dice." A few days later, they got pushed closer to the caves again. This time, it wasn't a full charge. It was a trickle. 1 man here, 2 there, testing. One of those men made it frighteningly close. He burst from a side tunnel no one had spotted at first, sprinting across 10 yards of open ground with a satchel charge hugged to his chest. Mitchell swung and fired. The first round hit. The man flinched but kept going. The second hit. He stumbled, but his fingers were white-knuckled on the fuse cord. It was the third round, at almost point-blank range, that tore into his throat and finally stopped him. The satchel tumbled into the rough ground and blew, throwing rocks and fragments over the trench, but sparing the squat fuel drum stack behind them, almost by pure chance. Later, as they picked shrapnel out of sandbags, Mitchell heard the platoon sergeant grumble. If that had been a Garand, he'd have been out of the game a yard off that hole. There were no extra Garands to be had, no extra bars. The Marine units had already sucked in every spare battle rifle they could find. What there were in abundance were crates of ammunition meant for planes that no longer flew from Peleliu. The original plan had called for making the island a long-term bomber base. Then logistics and strategy had shifted. Saipan and Tinian took priority. Some of the aircraft ammo dumped on Peleliu now sat, awkward and unused, behind the lines. Mitchell saw it every time he was sent back to fetch standard .30 carbine boxes. In the gloom of the ammo dump, stacks of crates with red and yellow stenciling sat off to one side, belted 30.06 and 50 rounds with tips painted in garish colors. The 50 belts were going back out to ships and anti-aircraft pits. The 30.06 belts, not so much. Those are for wing guns on planes we don't have anymore. A tired Navy ordnance rating had told him when he'd asked. Some of the patrol birds, sure, but most of this was for aircraft that never based here. Paperwork lagged behind reality. Mitchell watched as dust settled on them between resupply runs. He thought about bullets meant to kill aircraft. He thought about men who shrugged off his carbine's best efforts. He carried the idea around in his head for days, like a live coal. Then, after one too many close calls at the cave mouth, he found the man who could help him do something about it. Sergeant First Class Joe Nardi ran the little ammo and ordnance section assigned to the airfield approach. Nardi had been a gunsmith before the war. Everyone knew he had a habit of interpreting regulations creatively when they got between him and something that worked. One evening, while Nardi sat on an ammunition crate, scraping fouling out of a .30 barrel, Mitchell dropped onto the next crate with his carbine across his knees. "You ever reload?" Mitchell asked, nodding toward the stacked aircraft ammo. Nardi raised an eyebrow. "You asking hypothetically, or are you about to say something I should stop you from finishing?" he said. Mitchell looked down at his hands. The cut on his cheek from the last bullet strike had scabbed over. It itched. "I'm asking," he said slowly, "if there's a way to make this thing," he tapped the carbine's slim stock, "hit like it belongs on this island." Nardi looked past him, eyes narrowing toward the caves outlined against the sunset. "Then we're going to need to borrow a little fire from the sky," he said. Nardi's shop was just a stretch of scraped-clean coral under a camouflage tarp, but to Mitchell it might as well have been an alchemist's laboratory. On one side were the official tools, gauges for headspace, armorer's wrenches, spare parts. On the other were the unofficial ones, a small reloading scale that had somehow fallen off a stateside shipment, a couple of hand presses, and a scuffed bullet puller. Between them sat the crates. Nardi pried one open with the flat of a bayonet. Inside, neatly linked, were rows of .30-06 rounds. Their tips were painted in alternating colors. "APIT," Nardi said, tapping a black-tipped round with a thin white band. "Armor-piercing incendiary tracer, designed to punch into metal and light up whatever's inside. The tracer element's in the base." He picked up another with a red tip. "Straight tracer," he said. "Good for seeing. Less good for lighting things on fire by itself." He pointed at the stenciling on the crate, partially obscured by grime and hurried repainting. "Air Corps shipment," he said. "Meant for wing guns on P-39s and belly mounts on B-25s. Wrong war, wrong island. But bullets don't care where they were supposed to go." Mitchell unslung his carbine and locked the bolt back. The action sat there, small and almost fragile compared to the hulking aircraft guns these bullets were meant for. "This is a .30, he said. "Those are .30. So far, so good. Everything after that is the problem." "Yup," Nardi said. "Case is shorter, powder is different, pressures are different. You try to stuff one of these whole into that chamber, and you'll find out what your face looks like from the inside." He grinned humorlessly. "But the bullet? The bullet doesn't care what case it rides in. As long as it's the right diameter and you don't push it too fast, you can seat it wherever it fits." They set up the puller and started stripping bullets out of the .30-06 belts. Nardi's big hands worked with surprising delicacy, clamping, twisting, popping projectile after projectile free. The long, slender bullets clinked into a tin. "APIT or straight tracer?" Mitchell asked. "Start with tracer," Nardi said. "Less to go catastrophically wrong. We get that working, maybe we try a couple of the spicy ones." They weighed the aircraft tracer bullets against a standard 110-grain carbine projectile. "145 grains, Nardi said, peering at the scale. "Give or take, that's a big bump." They talked powder. The carbine used a relatively fast rifle powder that spiked quickly. Pushing a heavier bullet with the same charge was a recipe for trouble. "So we go down," Nardi said. "Less powder, lower velocity. You're not shooting across a football field. You're shooting across a street." They built 5 test rounds. Empty .30 carbine cases, reprimed, carefully charged a few grains under standard. The long tracer bullets seated deep enough to fit in the magazine, their colored tips just kissing the edge of the case mouth. The first shot came from a clamped rifle. They braced the carbine in a crude wooden sled, tied a cord to the trigger, and stacked sandbags around the receiver. "Everyone step back," Nardi called. Mitchell found himself holding his breath. Nardi pulled the cord. The carbine cracked. No explosion, no flying parts. The bolt cycled and locked open on the empty case. Downrange, 25 yards away, a rock outcrop sported a fresh chip and a fading smear of light. For a couple of seconds, they could see a faint, red-orange ember where the tracer had struck and dug in, glowing against the pale coral. "Pressure?" Mitchell asked. Nardi picked up the spent case and examined it like a jeweler. "No bulge. Primer looks fine. Extraction okay?" He nodded slowly. "We're in the ballpark." They fired the second test round from the shoulder. This time, Mitchell insisted on being the one to hold the rifle. "Your face," Nardi warned. "Your rules." Mitchell shouldered the carbine, took a kneeling position, and aimed at the same rock. The recoil felt different. Not dramatically harder, but sharper. The report had more bark. The tracer's path was unmistakable. It left the muzzle as a pinprick of light, then bloomed into a bright burning streak, arcing into the rock. At 30 yards, it was exactly where he'd aimed. He lowered the rifle, grinning despite himself. "I can see it," he said. "I can walk it right into them." They built more. They tested at 40 yards, then 50. The trajectory dropped more than standard ball, as expected. The heavier bullet, the lighter charge. But within the ranges, they were actually fighting, 20 to 60 yards in broken, rocky country. It was workable. The powders left more fouling. The barrel heated a little faster. Small prices. Finally, Nardi opened the other tin. "Time for the spicy ones," he said. The APIT bullets were heavier still. He limited Mitchell to 3 rounds. "Single shots only," he warned. "You treat these like rifle grenades, not plinking ammo." At the test rock, the effect was obvious. The impact of the APIT didn't just chip Sifuas, tone, and leave a glow. It spat a small, bright flash and a puff of smoke. On a scrap of soaked cloth tacked to a board, it punched through and left a little ring of char where the incendiary compound burned. "You get that into a man's load of grenades or a satchel," Nardi said. "You're going to have a bad time. For him." "And my carbine?" Mitchell asked. Nardi ran a thumb along the barrel. "As long as you don't rapid-fire a whole magazine of these, you'll probably be okay," he said. "Probably." He gave Mitchell 2 magazines. One mostly tracer, loaded with the lighter experimental rounds. One marked with a strip of red cloth at the base. 3 APIT rounds on top of standard tracer. "You keep the spicy mag for when you've got no other choice," Nardi said. "You hit caves, satchels, bunch targets. You do not, under any circumstances, let anybody else grab this out of your kit without them knowing what it is." Mitchell nodded. He slid the tracer mag home and felt the extra weight. He had, in effect, stolen a little fire from the sky and locked it into his small, maligned carbine. Now all he needed was another charge from a cave to see if it would make a difference. On Peleliu, he didn't have to wait long. Lance Corporal Saito Masaru had been in caves for so long that open air felt wrong. He remembered sun and wind as something from a different life. For weeks now, his world had been cramped limestone chambers, the stink of unwashed men and bad air, the distant thud of American artillery overhead. The orders had been clear. "We will hold Peleliu to the last. We will bleed the enemy not in one glorious charge, but in 1,000 cuts. You will fight from caves. You will survive bombardment. You will make the Americans pay for every step." He believed in the Emperor. He believed in doing his duty. By mid-October, he mostly believed in routine. Wake, crouch by the firing slit. Fire a few carefully aimed shots at any American unwise enough to walk in daylight. Duck when the mortars came in return. Sleep when you could. Endure the heat. But always, always, in the back of his mind, there was the urge to break out, to rush, to swing the sword he had taken from a fallen officer weeks before and feel something other than waiting. On the night of October 15th, his captain gave him permission. Mitchell Ridge, the Americans called it on their maps. To Saito, it was just another knobbled ravine with a cave mouth that had held back bulldozers and flamethrower teams longer than anyone expected. "We will not hold it forever," the captain had said in the dim cave light, "but we can hurt them tonight. Their engineers are close. Their trench is shallow. You will lead a small group and break their line. Kill as many as you can before you die. Saito had nodded, feelings knotting in his throat. Fear, pride, relief that the wait was over. He'd chosen his men carefully, the fiercest, the least wounded, those whose eyes still had something hard in them. They checked their rifles, they tied grenades to belts. Saito took the sword, a curved officer's blade that had somehow survived everything so far. They clustered at the cave mouth, breathing shallowly, waiting for a lull in the sporadic fire from the trench below. Then, at a hand signal, they surged. For the first few yards, everything went according to plan. The American trench in front of them spat a few surprised shots. Someone shouted in English. Muzzle flashes licked from the sandbags. One of Saito's men jerked and fell, hit by a bullet in the leg. He crawled on, dragging himself, face twisted. Saito's own heart hammered in his chest as he cleared the lip of the rocks and bounded down toward the shallow dip where the Americans had dug in. He saw one of them clearly now, a young man's face, pale against the dark coral, eyes wide, carbine pressed into his shoulder. He saw the first few bullets hit. They were almost comforting in their familiarity. Small puffs of impact, the punch of lead into muscle. One in Saito's chest, one in his side. He felt them. He staggered. He did not stop. Doctrine, training, the sheer momentum of his own legs, they all shoved him forward. He raised the sword higher, sucking in air through gritted teeth, and roared. Then the American's muzzle flash changed. Instead of the dull orange blink he'd seen thousands of times, a brighter, whiter light flared, edged with a strange green. For a heartbeat, Saito thought some flare gun had gone off. Then his chest exploded. It wasn't like the earlier hits. There was no sense of a punch or a blow. There was only a blinding white pain, heat, and the sensation of his ribs folding inward. He glimpsed, insanely clearly in that moment, a tiny sun blooming at the point of impact, sparks spraying from it like iron filings off a grinder. He thought of anti-aircraft fire, of seeing from a distance the glowing pearls of American tracers streak up into the sky in long chains, trying to catch passing bombers. The idea that such sky fire had just been driven straight through him didn't have time to fully form before his legs gave way. He hit the coral and knew nothing more. Behind him, in the dim cave, other men had seen only the flashes. When the next man tried to follow, and a tracer struck the satchel on his chest, the resulting blast shook dust from the ceiling. The survivors fell back from the mouth, eyes wide. "Kong no huo," one muttered, "the fire that belonged in the sky. They are firing it from their small guns, now." They had expected bullets. They had expected grenades. They had not expected to see the glowing lines that usually lace the night overhead come lashing horizontally into their mouths. To them, it felt like the Americans had stolen some piece of the God's war and rammed it into their rifles. For the first time, some of them hesitated. Mitchell couldn't hear any of that. He could only see the effect, shadowed figures flinching back from the cave, then the muzzle flash of at least one rifle deep inside, answering. The fight wasn't over, but the rules had shifted, and both sides, in their own way, had just realized it. Mitchell didn't have time to think about Japanese words or theological implications. He had a cave 40 yards away that still held rifles and grenades, and a trench behind him full of men who would die if that cave spat one good rush at the right moment. The man with the sword was down. The satchel carrier behind him had turned into a brutal, blooming explosion that blackened the cave lip and showered the approach rocks with charred cloth. But inside, there were still muzzle flashes, still echoing shouts. One of the voices was yelling more sharply now, barked commands in Japanese. Something about back and wait, and faintly, a phrase that included the characters for sky and fire. Mitchell caught none of it. What he caught was the flicker of movement in the shadows. He pressed himself tighter to the coral, angling his carbine so just the muzzle and a sliver of front sight poked around the edge. The rifle's handguard was hot now. He could feel the warmth even through his calloused palms. The heavier tracer loads and the APITs Nardi had warned him about weren't gentle on a small barrel. "Mitchell!" Langley hissed from behind him. "You still breathing up there?" "Yeah," Mitchell shot back, eyes never leaving the cave. "They sent one at me. He's not coming back. But they're not done." "Say when you want the bar," Langley said. "Keep it ready," Mitchell replied. "I'll light them. You cut them." His next shots were tracer only. He'd already used one of the 3 APIT rounds in dropping the swordman. The second had detonated the satchel on the raider behind him. That left one truly spicy round sitting on top of the remaining stack of tracer in his red-tagged magazine. He wasn't going to waste it on a glimpse. The entrance of the cave was deep enough to swallow muzzle flashes, but those flashes left after images in his eyes. A map of where, roughly, the firing ports sat inside. He put a tracer a foot above the last remembered flash and squeezed. The bullet streaked into the darkness like a thrown ember, leaving a line that hung in his vision even as he fired the next. He walked the glowing path along the left side of the entrance, then snapped a pair along the right. Inside, there were screams. One of them was high-pitched, pain-tight. Something clattered to the floor. Langley took the cue like the professional he was. The bar chattered, a deep, chopping roar compared to the carbine's crack. Mitchell saw the 3006 tracers, dimmer and straighter, punching into the areas he'd just painted. That was the real value of the sky fire, he realized. Not just what those individual rounds did, but what they showed. Every man in the trench could see where his burning bullets went. They didn't have to guess which patch of darkness he was worried about. They could follow his strokes like a spotlight made of ammunition. A grenade tumbled out of the cave, clinking on coral. "Frag!" someone yelled. Mitchell flinched back as the blast tore a chunk from the rock. Bits of coral stung his neck. "Keep 'em pinned!" the sergeant roared. "Don't let 'em swarm!" Mitchell's magazine was running low. He could feel it in the recoil pattern, in the slowing rhythm of the bolt. He decided it was time. He thumbed the mag release and let the half-spent tracer magazine fall into his palm. He jammed it under his belt for later, then slapped in the red-tagged mag Nardi had given him, the one with the last APIT sitting on top. He racked the bolt, chambering the heavy round. "Last big one," he muttered. He waited. There, movement, deeper in. A darker patch of shadow halfway up the cave wall, where they'd likely stacked ammunition or supplies. He couldn't see clearly, but he could guess. Places you'd put crates, places you'd think were safe from direct fire. He aimed for that patch, breathed out, squeezed. The shot sounded no different to his ears. But what it did 30 yards away was anything but normal. The APIT tracer punched into that half-seen darkness and blossomed. There was a hard, bright flash, a white-hot bloom like magnesium. A split second later, a secondary explosion ripped from the same spot. The cave belched fire. A gout of flame and smoke shot from the mouth, along with chunks of rock and something softer. A wave of hot air slapped Mitchell's face. "Jesus," Langley croaked. "Did you hit their ammo?" "Guess so," Mitchell said, ears ringing. Inside, the screaming changed pitch. It wasn't the short, sharp sound of surprise now. It was the long, ragged howl of men whose world had just gone from cramped and dark to burning and collapsing. "Push up! Push up to the lip!" the sergeant yelled. "Before they regroup!" They moved. Mitchell half vaulted, half rolled to a new notch in the coral, 10 yards closer. Langley and another rifleman followed, keeping up a rattling covering fire into the cave. Mitchell swapped back to the tracer magazine, now his only exotic ammo left. He fired controlling shots low, at leg height, just inside the smoke. Tracers skittered and bounced off rock, leaving lines of fire that briefly traced the cave's contours. Here and there, they found flesh. One round took a man in the thigh, just as he tried to stagger deeper into the tunnel. The tracer's burning base kept hissing inside his wound, and he dropped, clawing at his own leg. Another smacked into the edge of a wooden ammunition crate and buried itself. The incendiary compound did what it was due. Assigned to do. It burned. A moment later, another corner of the cave flickered into a small, hungry fire. Within minutes, the interior was an inferno. They didn't have to clear that cave room by room. The combination of standard HE grenades, bar fire, and Mitchell's stolen sky fire cooked it from the inside. By dawn, when engineers came to seal the entrance with explosives and bulldozed coral, the only sounds from within were the crackle of dying flames and the occasional pop of a cooking-off cartridge. Mitchell sat on a rock, Carbine resting upright between his knees, and watched the smoke rise. "You all right?" Nardi asked, appearing at his side as if conjured. "Yeah," Mitchell said, voice flat. "Gun all right?" Nardi asked. Mitchell ran a hand over the barrel. It was fouled, dirty, and hot, but it was in one piece. The action felt a little rough, but nothing a good cleaning wouldn't fix. "She held," he said. Nardi nodded. "Told you the little thing was tougher than it looked," he said. He jerked his chin toward the cave. "And that? That was one hell of a footnote." "Footnote?" Mitchell echoed. "Yeah," Nardi said. "Nobody upstairs is going to write, 'We stuffed aircraft ammo into carbines' in a formal report. They'll say, 'Rifle and automatic fire suppressed enemy cave.' But you and me know what really did the trick." Down in the sealed darkness, blackened stone still held the marks of where the sky fire rounds had struck. Up in the light, men who'd thought of the carbine as a pop gun glanced at Mitchell's weapon differently now. "Whatever you're feeding that," Langley said, "you keep it coming." "I don't know how much more there is," Mitchell admitted. They turned to look at the dwindling stack of crates in Nardi's area. Enough for a handful more magazines, not enough to turn doctrine on its head, but enough maybe to give a few more caves a taste of the sky. The official history of Peleliu doesn't mention Corporal James Mitchell's carbine. It talks about regiments and ridges, about casualty counts and timelines. It calls the island secured long before the last man stopped dying in its caves. In after-action reports, the fight at that particular cave entrance is reduced to a line. Enemy resistance in Coral Cave Complex neutralized by small arms, BAR, and demolitions. Somewhere, in a marginal note on an ordnance form, Nardi scribbled something like, "Limited use of tracer incendiary 30 cal bullets in carbine loads, effective against cave exits." The form went into a file. The file went into a box. The box went wherever wartime paperwork went when the war moved faster than the clerks. For the men on that ridge, it wasn't a footnote. It was the difference between another night of men with swords and satchels erupting out of that cave and the grim final heat of a sealed, burned-out position. Mitchell never got a medal for inventing Skyfire. He got the same campaign ribbon as everyone else, the same tired boat ride off the island, the same set of dreams about white flashes in the dark that woke him up sweating years later. He also got something less tangible, a new way of thinking about weapons. Back home, when he picked up a hunting rifle or an old pistol, he didn't just think in terms of this caliber versus that caliber. He thought about bullet construction, intended target, and what you could coax a machine to do if you respected its limits and nudged its design. He never told his father exactly what he'd done on Peleliu. But one summer evening, standing on the edge of their little airstrip, watching a crop duster's exhaust flame flicker in the dusk, he said, "You were right about machines. You push 'em wrong, they'll blow up. Push 'em right at the right moment. They can do more than they were meant to." His father just grunted, not asking for details. In the late 1940s and 50s, ordnance labs did in fact tinker with various .30 carbine loads, soft points, hollow points, specialized tracers. Somewhere in the back of some engineer's mind, or in a footnote he'd cleared from a box of reports, there was the whispered knowledge that men in the field had already tried crossing the streams between aircraft ammo and infantry weapons. In later wars, in Korea and Vietnam, soldiers and guerrillas on both sides would repeat the same improvised experiments, pulling API bullets from one caliber, seeding them in another, chasing that same vicious mix of light and heat. They'd learn the same lesson Mitchell had on Peleliu. Sometimes, adding a little visible fire to your shots changed not just what you hit, but what you and your comrades could see and react to. On the Japanese side, the phrase "sky fire" lingered in a few scattered accounts. Interrogation transcripts from surviving Peleliu defenders mention strange glowing bullets from small American rifles that burned where they struck. An Allied intelligence officer penciled "use of tracer in carbines" in the margin and moved on to the next report. Decades later, in a quiet living room in Kansas, Mitchell might tell the full story only rarely. If a grandson pointed at a war movie on TV and asked, "Grandpa, did you ever shoot tracer like that?" he'd smile a little, eyes going distant. "Yeah," he'd say, "once or twice." "Was it scary?" "Everything about it was scary," he'd answer honestly. "But I'll tell you this. For a little while, on one rotten hot island, that tiny rifle of mine finally hit like it belonged there." He wouldn't talk about the white flash in a man's chest or the way tracer lines painted the air in front of a cave like strokes from a burning brush. Those images were his to live with. But the lesson, that doctrine and supply gave you a starting point, and survival sometimes demanded you step beyond it, that stayed near the surface. In every war, there are the official weapons, the ones with manuals, specifications, and approved uses. Then there are the weapons men actually fight with. The bar with a bipod hacked off and a sling rigged just so. The triple-mounted M2 on a beachhead somewhere. The M1 carbine fed with special-issue rounds from a crate with red stenciling nobody was supposed to touch. The Japanese who survived that night on Peleliu didn't care about case dimensions or ordnance tables. To them, the carbine in that trench had suddenly started spitting. Something that looked and felt like the anti-aircraft web that had chased their pilots from the Pacific sky. They called it what it felt like: sky fire. And long after the last cave was sealed and the airstrips went quiet, that one small, desperate experiment hung in the air, a reminder that under enough pressure, a young corporal with a toy rifle and an old armorer with a bullet puller could, for a few brutal minutes, reach up into the arsenal of the sky and drag a little of its fire down into the fight.